The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and the particular brand of coffee that law firms always seem to buy in bulk, and I remember sitting in that stiff leather chair across from Mr. Halloran's desk, watching him slide a thin manila folder toward my mother and my uncle and my cousin Bate, and realizing with a sinking, hollow feeling that started somewhere behind my sternum and spread outward that there was no folder for me. Waiting for someone to explain to me why, out of the 5 grandchildren and 3 children my grandmother had left behind, I was the only one who hadn't been asked to a single meeting about how her estate would be divided. Where's mine? I finally asked, and the silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning cycling on in the vents above us. My mother finally looked up and said, "Honey, we didn't think you needed to be part of this. You and Grandma weren't exactly close at the end, and honestly there wasn't much left for extra people anyway once everyone got their fair share." I looked at Mr. Halloran, hoping for some kind of correction, some professional intervention that would set the record straight, and instead he folded his hands on his desk and said in a careful, measured voice, "Actually, Mrs. Delgado, I think there's something you should all know before this conversation goes any further." And he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a second envelope, cream-colored, sealed with wax the way Grandma always sealed her letters, with my name written across the front in her looping, old-fashioned handwriting. I need to go back because none of that makes any sense without understanding who my grandmother actually was to me and what not exactly close at the end really meant, which was not at all what my mother made it sound like in that office. My name is Elena, and I was the third of 5 grandchildren on my mother's side, sandwiched between my older cousin Bate, who was practically a second mother to the rest of us growing up, being the oldest by almost 8 years, and my younger brother Danny, who came along 4 years after me and immediately became, in the particular currency of my family, the favorite. I don't say that bitterly, or at least I try not to, because Danny is a genuinely good person and none of what happened was really his fault. But it's a fact, plain and observable, the way weather is a fact. Danny got the bigger birthday parties. Danny got taken to more of Grandpa's ball games before he passed when I was 12. Danny's report cards got taped to the refrigerator while mine got a quick glance and a "good job, sweetie," before being filed somewhere I never saw again. I don't think my parents sat down and decided this. I think it was more that Danny was easier, funnier, louder in a way that filled rooms, and I was quieter, more watchful, the kind of kid who noticed things instead of announcing them, and somewhere along the way, in a family of 5 grandchildren competing for a finite amount of adult attention, I simply lost more often than I won. My grandmother, though, my father's mother, Eleanor Whitcomb, was different, and she was different from the very beginning in a way that I've never been able to fully explain to people who didn't know her. My father passed away when I was 9, a sudden heart attack at 41 that none of us saw coming, and in the wreckage of that loss, in the years afterward when my mother was working 2 jobs to keep our house and drowning in a grief she never really let any of us see the bottom of, it was my grandmother, my father's mother, who became the fixed point in my life. Every Wednesday after school, without fail, for almost 15 years, I went to her house. She lived in a narrow, sun-warmed brick house on Marigold Street with a garden out back that she tended like a second job. And she taught me to bake bread there, actually bake it. From a starter she kept alive since before I was born, and she taught me to play gin rummy. And she was the first adult in my life after my father died who asked me questions and then actually sat still long enough to hear the answers. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make this sound like my mother's side of the family simply didn't love me, and that's not accurate, or at least it's not the whole truth. They loved me in the diffused, distracted way you love a fixture in your life that you've never had to. Those 2 kinds of love that you don't fully understand until you. We lived on both sides of it. Bate, my oldest cousin, used to tease me a little about it when we were younger, not unkindly, just observationally, the way kids notice things adults think they're hiding. "You're basically Grandma's favorite," she said to me once when I was maybe 15 and we were sitting on the porch steps at a family barbecue, and I remember feeling a strange mix of pride and unease at the comment. Because even then I understood on some instinctive level that being someone's favorite in a family like mine wasn't a gift, it was a target. And I was right to feel that unease, though it would take almost 20 more years for the target to actually get hit. The rest of the family didn't spend Wednesdays on Marigold Street. My Uncle Pete, my father's younger brother, lived 40 minutes away and visited Grandma Eleanor maybe once a month, usually with some errand attached, help moving furniture, help with her taxes, the kind of visit that served a purpose beyond just being present with her. My mother, technically Grandma's daughter-in-law rather than her blood, kept a cordial but not especially warm relationship with her. The two of them polite at family gatherings but never close, not the way I was close with her. Danny visited occasionally and Grandma loved him. She loved all of us, that's important to understand. She wasn't a woman who played favorites in some cruel, calculated way. She simply noticed who showed up over years consistently in the unglamorous middle-of-the-week way that doesn't photograph well for anyone's memory highlight reel, and she loved that person accordingly, which happened through nobody's grand design to be me. By the time I was in my 20s, working my first real job as a paralegal, still living close enough to visit Grandma regularly, our Wednesday tradition had evolved but never broken. I'd bring her groceries sometimes, help her with her email when she finally got a computer at 78 and immediately regretted it, sit with her on the porch in the evenings while she told me stories about my father as a boy, stories nobody else in the family seemed to think to ask her for, stories I started writing down eventually in a notebook I kept specifically for that purpose, because I understood even then that these stories were finite. That she was the only person left who remembered my father as a child, and that when she was gone, that particular window into him would close forever. The trouble, the actual seeds of what happened later, started about 6 years before Grandma died when she began having small strokes, the kind doctors call transient ischemic attacks, little warning shots that didn't leave lasting damage on their own but signaled unmistakably that bigger trouble was building. That was when my Uncle Pete, who had shown up to Marigold Street maybe a dozen times in the previous decade, suddenly started showing up every week. That was when my mother, who I don't think had called Grandma Eleanor on the phone more than a handful of times a year in my whole life, started calling her every Sunday. I want to be fair and acknowledge that some of this was probably genuine concern, the kind that gets activated in people when they're confronted with a parent's mortality. But some of it, and I say this having watched it unfold in real time with a paralegal's trained eye for documentation and timing, was something else entirely. I remember the first time I noticed it clearly. It was a Sunday dinner, maybe 5 years before Grandma passed, and my Uncle Pete brought up, seemingly casually over the pot roast, that he'd been helping Mom get her affairs in order, and that they'd met with a financial advisor the week before to simplify some things. Needing some beneficiary information, boring stuff, don't worry about it. I did worry about it a little, but I told myself I was being paranoid, that Pete was Grandma's son and had every right to help her manage her finances as she got older. And I let it go, the way you let go of a lot of small warning signs in families, because confronting them feels disproportionate to the size of the thing itself, until you look back later and realize the size of the thing was never the point, the pattern was. Over the following years, I watched, from a slight remove, as my Uncle Pete became increasingly, almost professionally involved in Grandma Eleanor's finances and legal affairs. He drove her to doctor's appointments, which I was grateful for genuinely because I had a full-time job and couldn't always get away on weekday afternoons the way he could as someone who ran his own small business with flexible hours. But he also, I noticed, started attending those appointments alone without me or my mother or anyone else PR. Even the ones that weren't strictly medical, the ones with her financial advisor, her estate attorney, meetings that in a healthier family might have included more than one relative as a matter of basic transparency. I brought this up with my mother once, carefully, over coffee, not wanting to sound accusatory toward my own uncle, and she waved it off much the way Pete had. He's just being helpful, Elena. Somebody has to manage all that, and you know how she gets confused with paperwork now. It was true that Grandma's memory had started to slip in small ways by then, nothing dramatic, mostly just the ordinary fog of being in her mid-80s, forgetting where she'd put her reading glasses, repeating a story she'd already told twice in one visit. But confused with paperwork is exactly the kind of phrase that gets used to justify all sorts of things in families where money and inheritance are quietly, invisibly rearranging themselves behind closed doors. And I knew that professionally, even if I didn't yet have proof of anything specific enough to act on. I want to talk about Bate here, my cousin, because her role in all of this matters, and it surprised me, honestly, more than almost anything else that happened. Bate had always struck me as the responsible one, the oldest, the one who organized the family group chat and remembered everyone's birthdays and generally held herself to a higher standard of fairness than the rest of us. But somewhere in those last few years of Grandma's life, Bates started spending a lot of time at Marigold Street too, and unlike me, her visits weren't Wednesday afternoons of gin rummy and bread starter. They were, from what I could piece together later, focused conversations about the house, about whether Grandma should sell it and move somewhere smaller, about who in the family might be in a position to take it over if she did decide to downsize. Conversations that always seemed to circle back eventually to Bates' own situation. Her growing family, her need for more space, her husband's business that could really use the extra capital a sale might provide. None of this was happening in secret, exactly not in the sense of locked doors and whispered conversations. It was happening in plain sight, in a family that had simply collectively decided not to loop me in on any of it. And I think that's actually the more painful version of exclusion, not the dramatic kind where someone actively hides something from you, but the quiet, almost accidental kind, where you're simply not on the list of people whose presence occurs to anyone as necessary. I wasn't hiding from these conversations. I was never say something every Wednesday through all of this. Still the one sitting with Grandma Elena in the evenings. Still the one who noticed when her memory took a sharper dip. Who called her doctor directly when I got worried about a fall she'd mentioned almost in passing. Who sat with her for 4 hours in an emergency room waiting area when that fall turned out to have fractured her wrist. 4 hours during which I called my mother twice and got no answer and texted Pete. Who eventually responded, an hour and a half later with, "Oh no, keep me posted, can't get away right now." I wasn't absent from her life. I was, if anything, more present in the granular, unglamorous, day-to-day sense than almost anyone else in the family. I just wasn't present in the specific rooms where decisions about money were being made, and I didn't fully understand until much later how much that particular kind of absence would end up costing me. Grandma Eleanor started declining more noticeably about a year and a half before she died, and it was during that period that the estrangement my mother would later describe in that lawyer's office, the "not exactly close at the end" comment, actually took root, though not in the way my mother implied. What happened was this. Grandma's memory issues progressed to the point where her doctor recommended she not live alone anymore. And the family, meaning primarily my Uncle Pete and my mother, decided, in a series of conversations I was not part of, that Grandma should move into an assisted living facility about 25 minutes from where Pete lived, and 45 minutes from where I lived, rather than one closer to Marigold Street. Which would have kept her nearer to me and to the neighborhood and the life she'd built there for 50 years. I found out about the decision after it had already been made in a phone call from my mother that started with, "So we found a great place for your grandmother, she's moving in next month," phrased exactly like an announcement rather than a conversation I might have had opinions about. I asked why. They'd chosen a facility so far from Marigold Street, and my mother said, a little defensively, that Pete had done most of the research since he was the one with more flexible time to visit, and that the facility they chose had excellent reviews and a good memory care wing for when she'd eventually need it. I couldn't really argue with the facility's quality, but I could and did point out that moving her farther from me, her most consistent visitor for over a decade, seemed like a strange choice if visitation and connection were actually the priority. And my mother said in a tone that I now recognize in hindsight as the exact tone people use when they're protecting a decision they know doesn't hold up well under scrutiny. "Well, Elena, we can't plan everything around your schedule." I want to be honest that I let that comment sting more than I probably should have in the moment, because it landed on an old bruise, the same bruise from childhood, the sense of being an afterthought dressed up as a practical consideration. But I told myself again that I was being paranoid, that the facility choice was probably genuinely about logistics and not about anything more calculated, and I adjusted my life around the new distance the way I'd adjusted around everything else, driving the extra 20 minutes each way, rearranging my Wednesday schedule to account for the longer trip, because the destination, Grandma Eleanor, mattered more to me than the inconvenience of getting there. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that the assisted living facility Pete had chosen happened to be 5 minutes from the office of an estate attorney Pete had started working with directly, a different attorney than the one Grandma had used for decades, a man named Feldman rather than the Halloran who'd handled her affairs and my father's affairs before that, for as long as and found her looking flustered and upset, a folder of papers spread across her lap that she quickly, almost guiltily, tried to gather up when I walked in. "What's all this, Grandma?" I asked, and she waved a hand and said it was nothing, just some paperwork Pete had brought by, but I could see in the brief glimpse I got before she closed the folder that it was some kind of legal document, dense with the small print of an attorney's letterhead I didn't recognize, and that she'd been crying or close to it, her eyes red-rimmed in a way that made my stomach tight immediately. I asked her gently if she was okay, if something about the paperwork was upsetting her, and she looked at me for a long moment, the fog that sometimes clouded her expression those days lifting just slightly, just enough for me to see something sharp and worried underneath it, and she said, "I don't like signing things I don't fully understand anymore, Elena. It used to be easier for me to keep it all straight." I offered to look over the papers with her since it was literally my job to read dense legal documents for a living, and she hesitated, glanced at the folder, and then said quietly, almost like she was confessing something, "Pete said it's better if just he handles it since he's already been working with the lawyer on everything. He said it would just confuse things to have too many people looking at it." I sat with that sentence for a long time after I left the facility that day, driving home with my hands too tight on the steering wheel, running back through every piece of the pattern I'd been gently talking myself out of noticing for years. The meetings without other family present, the facility chosen close to Pete's own routines rather than mine, the new attorney with a name I'd never heard my grandmother mention in decades of estate planning conversations. And the sentence, "It would just confuse things to have too many people looking at it," which is, I knew from professional experience, exactly the kind of language that gets used, sometimes innocently and sometimes not, to isolate an elderly person's decision-making from any outside scrutiny. I did something that week that I probably should have done years earlier. I called Mr. Halloran directly, the attorney who'd handled Grandma Eleanor's affairs for as long as I'd been alive, the one who'd drafted her original will after my grandfather passed, the one whose office I'd sat in as a teenager once, waiting for Grandma during an appointment, reading old magazines in his lobby. I explained carefully what I'd seen, the new attorney's letterhead, Grandma's confusion and distress, the pattern of Pete managing things increasingly alone. Mr. Halloran was quiet for a moment on the phone, and then he said something that I've thought about many times since. "Elena, I appreciate why. Oh, calling me, and I want you to know I've had some concerns of my own. Your grandmother reached out to me about 4 months ago, actually wanting to make some changes to her estate plan and specifically wanting to keep those changes confidential from certain family members for the time being. I can't discuss the substance of what she asked me to do. Attorney-client privilege doesn't end just because a family member is worried, but I can tell you that she was of entirely sound mind when she came to me, and that she was very deliberate and clear about what she wanted." I asked him cautiously what I should do, whether I should try to intervene somehow, get Grandma evaluated for capacity, involve other family members, and he said in a measured, careful voice, "I don't think you need to do anything at all right now except keep being who you've been to her. She talks about you a great deal, Elena. I think you should trust that she knows exactly what she's doing, and that she's protecting something in her own way that she doesn't want interfered with before she's ready." A kind of cautious, unearned relief, as though some part of me understood before I consciously did, that whatever was happening with that other attorney and that hidden folder, my grandmother hadn't lost herself in it. She was steering something. Still, in the months that followed, the family dynamic around Grandma Eleanor's care and her affairs continued to tilt further away from me, and I felt it happening in real time even as I kept showing up every Wednesday, kept sitting with her in the evenings, kept writing down her stories about my father in that notebook that was now almost entirely full. My mother started referring, in family conversations I was included in, to the plan, as in once the plan is finalized we'll figure out logistics, never specifying what the plan actually was, and when I asked directly I got vague answers about it still being worked out with the lawyers and being told not to worry about it, that everything would be handled fairly. Danny, my brother, seemed to know more than he let on, based on a few slips in conversation, references to when the house situation gets sorted, that he'd catch himself making and then quickly change the subject. And when I pressed him once gently over a beer about what exactly the house situation was, he looked genuinely uncomfortable and said, "Honestly, Elena, I don't really know the details. I just know Pete's handling most of it and Mom trusts him. So I haven't asked too many questions." I understood hearing that Danny wasn't lying to me exactly, but he also wasn't curious enough on my behalf to find out something that would clearly, obviously matter to me, and that quiet incuriosity stung almost as much as active exclusion would have. Grandma Eleanor passed away on a Tuesday morning in early March, peacefully in her sleep at the facility. And I got the call from my mother at 6:15 in the morning and drove there in a fog so thick I don't actually remember most of the drive. Just arriving in the parking lot and sitting in my car for several minutes before I could make myself go inside. Because some part of me needed those few minutes alone before I had to share the grief with anyone else, needed to just feel privately. The full weight of losing the one person in my family who had made me feel consistently for over 2 decades, like I mattered exactly as much as anyone else in the room. The funeral was 3 weeks later, delayed slightly because Pete wanted to make sure a cousin from out of state could attend, and I threw myself into the planning of it in the way I throw myself into anything that lets me channel grief into usefulness, choosing the flowers Grandma would have actually liked instead of the generic arrangement the funeral home suggested, tracking down the specific hymn she'd once told me years earlier she wanted played at her funeral. A detail I don't think anyone else in the family even knew she'd shared with me. I gave the eulogy, because when Pete asked, somewhat reluctantly I noticed who wanted to speak. Nobody else volunteered right away, and I stood up at that podium and talked about Wednesdays on Marigold Street, about bread starter and gin rummy and stories about my father as a boy. And I watched through my own tears as half the room, cousins and family friends who apparently hadn't fully understood the depth of that relationship, until they heard it laid out in specific textured detail, wiped their eyes too. It was at the reception afterward in the fellowship hall of the church over sheet cake and lukewarm coffee that I first heard in passing from my cousin Bates' husband, a comment that made my stomach drop the way that folder in Grandma's lap had months earlier. He mentioned casually, not realizing apparently that I hadn't been told, that the meeting with Halloran was scheduled for the following week, and that he I should ask Bate. I did ask Bate that same evening, calling her instead of waiting because I was done by that point, letting these things slide past me unacknowledged. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "There's a meeting at Halloran's office next Thursday to go over the estate. I figured Mom or Uncle Pete would have told you." I told her plainly that nobody had told me anything, and she said, sounding genuinely a little flustered, "I'm sure it's just an oversight. I'll call Pete and make sure you're looped in." And I let myself believe for the length of that phone call that it really was just an oversight, a logistics error in a grieving, disorganized family rather than a deliberate exclusion. I did not get looped in. I found out from my mother only 2 days before the meeting, and only because I called her directly to ask point blank whether I was expected to attend, and she said, with a hesitation in her voice I didn't like, "Oh honey, I don't think you need to come to that one. It's mostly just paperwork, boring legal stuff. We'll fill you in on everything after." I told her firmly that I wanted to be there, that I was one of Grandma's 5 grandchildren and deserved to understand what was happening with her estate the same as anyone else. And my mother said, after another uncomfortable pause, "Okay, well, if you really want to, I guess you can come," in a tone that made it clear my presence was being tolerated rather than welcomed. I showed up to that meeting, and it was in that meeting, in Mr. Halloran's office with the coffee smell and the stiff leather chairs, that the scene I described at the very beginning unfolded. The folder sliding across the desk to my mother, my Uncle Pete, and Bate, and no folder for me, and the sinking realization that this exclusion hadn't been an oversight at all. It had been a plan executed with just enough plausible deniability that each individual moment could be waved off as a miscommunication, while the pattern, taken as a whole, made its intention unmistakable. What I learned in the moments that followed before Mr. Halloran produced that second envelope was almost worse than the exclusion itself, because it revealed just how thoroughly the rest of the family had already decided among themselves how things would go. My Uncle Pete had apparently been added as a co-owner on several of Grandma's financial accounts in the 2 years before her death, a fact that under normal circumstances might have simply reflected sensible estate planning, giving a trusted family member access to help manage her affairs as her memory declined, but which, combined with everything else, sat wrong in my stomach the moment I heard it. Those accounts, structured that way, would pass directly to Pete outside of the formal will process entirely, a detail my mother mentioned almost proudly, framing it as evidence of how much Grandma had trusted Pete, without seeming to register how convenient it was that the largest liquid assets in the estate had been quietly rooted around any kind of transparent division among the grandchildren. The house on Marigold Street, the one place in the world that had meant more to me than almost anywhere else, had, according to the will Halloran had apparently drafted years earlier and which the family was treating as the final word, been left to Bate with a stated intention that she and her family would move into it, given her need for more space and Grandma's stated wish, according to my mother, that the house stay in the family and be lived in, not sold to strangers. I understood the sentiment behind that genuinely, and I might even have been at peace with Bate inheriting the house, if I'd been told about it directly, if it had been framed as a decision. And a scattering of smaller personal items, jewelry, some furniture, a set of china, had apparently already been divided among my mother, Pete, Bate, and Danny in the weeks since the funeral, and conversations and a follow-up meeting I hadn't been invited to. Based on an inventory list I later learned Pete had drawn up himself, without an appraiser, without any outside oversight, simply working from memory and preference as he and my mother walked through Grandma's belongings at the facility and later at the Marigold Street house, deciding between the two of them who wanted what. I sat in that lawyer's office, hearing all of this laid out piece by piece, and felt something in me go very quiet and very still, the particular stillness that comes right before either you fall apart or you don't, and I chose in that moment not to fall apart, not there, not in front of them. I asked evenly, so there's nothing for me at all, is that what everyone's telling me right now? And it was my mother who answered, in that voice I'd heard my whole life, the voice that always managed to make her own choices sound like they were simply the natural, unavoidable shape of things. Honey, we didn't think you needed to be part of this. You and Grandma weren't exactly close at the end, and honestly there wasn't much left for extra people anyway once everyone got their fair share. You and Grandma weren't exactly close at the end. I want you to understand exactly how untrue that sentence was, and exactly how deliberately my mother must have constructed it in her own head in order to say it out loud with a straight face. I had been at Marigold Street, and then at the facility every single Wednesday for over 2 decades, through my father's death, through my own 2 failed relationships, through the ordinary attrition of adult life that makes most people's visits to aging relatives grow thinner over time rather than thicker. I had sat in that emergency room for 4 hours with a fractured wrist that wasn't even mine. I had noticed the folder in her lap, the confusion in her eyes, the sentence about not wanting too many people looking at things, months before anyone else in this family apparently noticed anything was wrong at all. I had given the eulogy, because when the moment came for someone to actually stand up and speak the truth of who Grandma Eleanor had been, I was the only person in the room whose grief and knowledge ran deep enough to do it. My mother's sentence wasn't a description of reality. It was a story she needed to be true in order to feel comfortable with what she and Pete and Bate had already done, and I understood, sitting there, that she had probably been telling herself some version of that story for months, maybe longer, quietly building the narrative that would let her live with the outcome. That's when Mr. Halloran cleared his throat and said the family should know something before this went any further, and reached into his drawer and produced the second envelope, cream-colored, sealed with wax, my name written across the front in Grandma Eleanor's looping, unmistakable handwriting. I want to walk through the low point first, though, because it happened in the space of those next several seconds before the envelope was even opened, and I think it's important not to rush past it. Because in that moment, before I knew what was inside, all I felt was the accumulated weight of every Wednesday, every story written down in that notebook, every hour spent tending to a relationship the rest of my family had apparently decided, collectively and silently, didn't count for anything when it came time to divide what she left behind. I felt, for the first time in my adult life, a grief that wasn't really about Grandma Eleanor's death at all, not comparison had actually shown up. I felt small in that chair, smaller than I had felt in years, and some old, familiar voice in my head, the one built from a childhood of taped-up report cards that weren't mine and ball games I wasn't taken to, started telling me that this was simply confirmation of what had always been true, that I didn't count as much as the others that I never had. And then Mr. Halloran slid that envelope across the desk to me and said, "Your grandmother came to see me about 4 months ago, Elena, and she asked me to hold on to this and only open it under one specific condition." She told me, and I remember her words very clearly because she made me write them down so I wouldn't get them wrong. She said, "If my family divides things up without including Elena the way I'm afraid they might, I want you to give her this in front of all of them, and I want you to make sure they understand exactly what it means." I sat there, staring at my own name in her handwriting, and for a moment I couldn't make myself open it, because some part of me was terrified it would be a kind letter and nothing more. Words of love with no actual weight behind them, which would have been its own kind of devastating in that room in that moment. Surrounded by people who'd already divided up everything that mattered in practical terms. But Mr. Halloran nodded at me gently and said, "Go ahead, Elena, she wanted you to open it yourself." Inside was a letter, several pages in Grandma Eleanor's handwriting, and folded inside the letter, a second formal document with Mr. Halloran's letterhead, dated 4 months before her death, the same visit he'd mentioned to me on the phone all those months ago when I'd first called him worried about the folder in her lap. I read the letter out loud because Mr. Halloran gently suggested I might want to, given what he called the nature of what your grandmother wanted this family to hear together. And my voice shook through the first paragraph before steadying, the way it does when you commit to getting through something difficult in front of an audience. Grandma had written, "My dear Elena, if you are reading this, it means my fears about my family came true, and I want you to know before anything else that this was never a surprise to me. I have watched over the last several years as Pete positioned himself closer and closer to my finances, as Bate began circling the house on Marigold Street like it was already hers, and as your mother, out of some combination of grief for your father and simple exhaustion, let both of them lead her along without asking the hard questions she should have asked. I am not angry at them, not exactly. People do what they do, and grief and money together bring out patterns in families that were probably always there underneath, waiting for an opportunity. But I want you to understand that I was not confused and I was not manipulated, not in the ways that matter. I knew exactly what was happening, and I decided deliberately to let it happen in one sense, while quietly protecting what mattered most in another." She went on, "You were the one who showed up, Elena, every single Wednesday for over 20 years, not because you wanted something from me, but because you loved me plainly and without an agenda, in a way I don't think anyone else in this family managed to do, not even your mother, whom I loved dearly in her own way but who I don't think ever quite forgave the world for taking your father, and who let that grief make her passive in places she should have been present. You sat with me in that emergency room. You noticed when I was frightened and confused about paperwork before anyone else did. You wrote down every story I told you about your father, and I know you did because and I could feel the room around me, my mother, my Uncle Pete, Bate, growing very still as I read. And I want to be honest that some small human part of me took a fierce, unashamed satisfaction in that stillness, in finally being the one holding the words that mattered in that room. So here is what I did, Elena. I let Pete believe he'd successfully consolidated my liquid accounts under his name because I did not have the strength at 86 with a body that was failing me faster than I wanted to admit, to fight him on every account in every form, and because, frankly, I decided those particular funds were not the ones that mattered most to me in the end. I let your mother and Bate believe the house on Marigold Street would go to Bate, because I understood, watching her circle it, how much she needed the space for her growing family, and because I did not want my death to become the occasion for a war over a building, when the building itself was never really the point of what I wanted to leave behind. And then, the part that mattered most, the part that Mr. Halloran had come to that lawyer's office prepared to explain if I hadn't understood it from the letter alone. What I did instead, Elena, 4 months before writing this letter, was establish a trust, funded by the sale of a piece of property your grandfather and I purchased many years ago, land out near the lake that none of the rest of the family knew still existed, because I never mentioned it deliberately, precisely so it would remain outside of whatever picture Pete and your mother had assembled of my full estate. That land was worth, at the time I sold it, more than every account Pete believes he successfully claimed combined. The proceeds are held in a trust in your name, Elena, with you as sole beneficiary, and I have named you as executor of my full estate, not just this trust, which means that everything Pete, your mother, and Bate believe they have already secured is, in fact, subject to your oversight and your approval as the person legally responsible for making sure my actual wishes, not their assumptions, are carried out. I remember looking up from the letter at that point and seeing my Uncle Pete's face had gone a pale, waxy color, and my mother's mouth was slightly open, and Bate had set down the coffee cup she'd been holding with a small, sharp clatter against the saucer. Mr. Halloran gently took over from there, explaining in plain, careful legal language what the letter meant in practical terms. The will the family had already been operating under, the the one that left the accounts effectively to Pete in the house to Bate, that was real and those provisions would stand. Grandma had been clear about that in her instructions to him. She genuinely did want Pete to have those accounts and Bate to have the house, not as some trick to be revoked later. But the trust, the one funded by the lake property none of them had known about, was a separate legal instrument entirely, created afterward, deliberately kept confidential from everyone except Mr. Halloran and apparently myself as of that very moment. And its terms named me not only as the sole beneficiary of a sum that Mr. Halloran quietly stated in a way that made Pete visibly flinch, exceeded $400,000. But as executor with legal oversight over the entire estate process going forward, meaning every account transfer, every distribution, every step of settling Grandma Eleanor's affairs now required my formal sign-off before it could be finalized. The silence in that office after Mr. Halloran finished explaining all of that stretched out long enough that I could hear, again, the air conditioning cycling through the vents, and it was my Uncle Pete who broke it first, his voice tight and than raised volume ever could have said. She specifically instructed me not to route that transaction through any of the accounts you had access to, Mr. Whitcomb. She used a different bank entirely, one she opened herself in person at a branch near her old neighborhood without informing anyone in the family. I want to be clear that everything she did was fully within her legal rights and was executed while she was assessed by two separate physicians whose evaluations I required specifically because I anticipated this conversation might happen, to have full mental capacity to make these decisions. Bate, who had gone very quiet, finally spoke, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. So the house is still mine, but Elena has to approve everything else. Mr. Halloran nodded and said, yes, that was correct. The house transfer to Bate would proceed as originally written, but that as executor I would be responsible for reviewing and formally approving the full accounting of the estate, including the accounts already transferred to Pete, before the estate could be legally closed, which meant in practice that nothing further could move forward without my explicit sign-off. My mother finally turned to me, and I watched something complicated pass across her face, not quite an apology, not yet, but something closer to the beginning of a reckoning with what she'd actually done. Elena, I didn't know about any of this. I promise you I had no idea she'd set something like that up. I believed her, actually, in that specific claim. I don't think she'd known about the trust any more than Pete had. But I told her, as steadily as I could manage, that not knowing about the trust didn't erase the fact that she'd sat in that room minutes earlier, and told me I hadn't been close to Grandma at the end, that there hadn't been much left for extra people like me, when in fact there had been all along a woman 4 months from her death, sitting in this exact office, quietly making sure that the daughter of hers who'd actually shown up wouldn't be erased from the story, even if the rest of the family tried to write her out of it. I said, and I remember choosing these words carefully, deliberately, because I wanted them to land with weight rather than heat. I'm not upset that Bate is getting the house or that Pete has those accounts. Grandma clearly wanted that, and I respect her wishes, even the parts of them that don't include me directly. What I'm upset about, what I think all of you need to actually sit with, is that none of you thought to include me in a single conversation about her estate, not one meeting, not one phone call, and the reason you gave me for that exclusion was that I wasn't close to her, when the truth is I was the closest person to her in this entire family, and some part of every one of you knew that, which is exactly why it was easier to leave me out of the room than to face that fact directly. Nobody said anything for a long moment, and then my mother started to cry quietly and said, "You're right, I think I knew that some." Part of me knew that, and it made me feel guilty, and it was easier to just not think about it, to let Pete handle things and tell myself it was fine. It wasn't a full accounting of everything that had happened, and I didn't expect it to be, not in that room, not in that moment. But it was the first time in longer than I could remember that my mother had told me something true about her own choices, rather than reframing them into something more comfortable. The days and weeks that followed the reading of that second envelope were, honestly, some of the strangest of my life, because I found myself, almost overnight, holding a kind of authority over my own family that I had never asked for and wasn't entirely sure I wanted. As executor, I had to review every account transfer Pete had already made. And in doing that review, working closely with Mr. Halloran, I discovered but the kind of self-serving rounding that happens when a person is managing an aging relative's finances without enough outside oversight and starts to blur the line between what's owed to them and what they've simply made convenient for themselves. I had every legal right to require him to return that amount to the estate, to be redistributed according to the will's actual terms. And after several difficult, tense conversations, that's exactly what I required, not out of spite, but because it was simply the correct and fair thing to do, and because I understood finally that being the person who noticed things, who paid attention to the fine print, wasn't a burden I needed to apologize for anymore. It was, in fact, exactly the quality my grandmother had trusted most in me. Bate, to her credit, reached out to me privately about 2 weeks after that meeting without Pete or my mother present, and told me with what sounded like genuine discomfort that she'd had no idea how completely I'd been excluded from the process until that day in Halloran's office, and that in hindsight she was ashamed of how easily she'd gone along with it, assuming the way people do when it's convenient that someone else in the family had surely looped me in. So she didn't need to be the one to check. She told me she still wanted the house, and I told her honestly that I thought she should have it, that Grandma had wanted that and I wasn't going to stand in the way of it, but that I needed her going forward to actually include me in decisions the way I'd never been included before, not out of guilt, but because I was in fact part of this family, whether it had been convenient for people to remember that or not. She agreed, and in the 2 years since, she has mostly kept that promise, inviting me to walk through Marigold Street with her before the renovations started, asking my opinion about which of Grandma's things should stay in the house versus go into storage, small gestures that wouldn't have meant much on their own but that added up over time into something that felt finally like actual inclusion rather than performance. My relationship with Pete has never fully recovered, and I've made a kind of peace with that. He paid back the overage eventually after enough pressure from Mr. Halloran, and enough of my own quiet, steady insistence that I wasn't going to simply let it slide the way the rest of the family had let so many things slide over the years. But he's remained distant with me since, polite at the handful of family gatherings we've both attended, but cool in a way that tells me he's never fully forgiven me for what he experienced, unfairly I think, as an attack on his integrity. Rather than what it actually was, a simple accounting of what our grandmother had actually wanted. I've decided I can live with that distance. I spent enough years bending myself around the comfort of people who wouldn't extend the same effort back to me, and I'm no longer willing to make an exception for family members simply because the word family is doing the heavy lifting instead of their actual behavior. The trust itself, the money from that like property none of us had known existed, changed my life in practical terms, obviously in ways that matter, letting me pay off the last of my student loans, letting me put a real down payment on a house of my own for the first time, a smaller version in some ways of the kind of home Grandma had built on Marigold Street, with its own patch of garden I've started, tentatively, clumsily, trying to learn to tend the way she tended hers. But honestly, the money was never really the part of that envelope that mattered most to me. What mattered most was the letter itself, which I've read so many times now that the creases in the paper have gone soft, the part where she wrote in her loopy NG handwriting that she had watched for years and known exactly what was happening in her family, and had chosen, deliberately, patiently, without ever once making a scene about it while she was alive. The particular quality of silence that followed my question, "Where's mine?" a question I asked out loud finally after a lifetime of swallowing versions of it in a dozen smaller rooms throughout my childhood. And I think about the cream-colored envelope sealed with wax the way she sealed all her letters, my name written across the front in handwriting I would know anywhere. And I understand now that it wasn't really about the money inside it, or even about being named executor, though both of those things mattered in their own practical ways. It was about being seen, finally and unmistakably, by the one person in my family who had actually been paying attention all along, and about learning at 34 years old that the love you give consistently, quietly, without an audience and without an agenda, doesn't disappear just because the people around you fail to notice it. Sometimes it's simply waiting, patient and deliberate, in an envelope you don't know exists yet, for the exact moment you need it most.